Hello and welcome. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, you don't need to think about where you've been or what tomorrow might ask of you. All you need to do is settle in, get comfortable, and let the world slow down for a while. In this series, Sleepy Journeys, we'll be traveling together, sometimes to real places, deep forests, quiet rivers, forgotten paths, sometimes to places that couldn't possibly exist, but feel calm enough that they probably should. There's no rush, no danger, and no destination we need to reach. The journey itself is enough. Before you get cozy, though, take just a moment to gently support the channel. If you enjoy these quiet stories, consider liking the video and subscribing, so other sleepy souls wandering the internet late at night can find their way here too. You can also leave a comment with where you're listening from. It's comforting to know we're all resting together, even from far away. Now, find a position that feels easy. Let your breathing soften. There's nothing you need to follow closely, and nothing important you might miss. When you're ready, we'll begin our journey. Slowly, calmly, and one peaceful step at a time. In the quiet centuries around the year 1000, long before any Norse ship crossed the Western Ocean, a group of people from the far north lived at the meeting point of land and sea. Their world was shaped by narrow coastlines and cold water. Fjords cut deeply into the land, offering shelter from the open ocean while also serving as natural roads. Along these shores stood small communities, clusters of longhouses built from timber, stone, and turf, their low roofs designed to hold warmth against wind and snow. Life here followed the rhythm of the seasons. Summer was brief and intense. Fields were worked quickly while the ground remained soft. Livestock grazed on thin grass, watched carefully to prevent loss. Boats moved frequently during these months, carrying people between settlements and out to fishing grounds where cold waters provided steady nourishment. Winter arrived slowly, then stayed. Snow-covered paths and pasture alike. Ice formed along the edges of fjords. Travel became difficult and sometimes impossible. During these months, people spent long hours indoors, close to one another, sharing warmth and conserving energy. Firewood was used carefully. Food stores were measured and rationed. Daily life depended on cooperation. Men and women worked together in tasks that rarely changed. Nets were mended, clothing repaired, and tools maintained for as long as possible. Wool was spun and woven by hand. Leather was softened and shaped into boots and gloves. Children learned by watching, absorbing skills through repetition rather than instruction. The sea was always present. It provided fish, transport, and connection to distant places. It also demanded respect. Weather could change without warning. Fog could erase familiar landmarks. Ice drifted unpredictably. Knowledge of the sea was not written down, but carried in memory, passed quietly from elder to child. Navigation relied on careful observation. Sailors watched the sun's path, the behavior of clouds, and the movement of birds. They learned how watercolors shifted near land and how swells behaved when shore lay ahead. At night, familiar stars offered orientation when skies were clear. Ships were central to this way of life. Long ships and cargo vessels were built with overlapping planks designed to move flexibly through rough water. Woolen sails caught wind when it allowed, and oars provided steady motion when it did not. These ships were not symbols of conquest. They were tools, essential, practical, and carefully maintained. Despite their skill at sea, the Norse did not travel without reason. Journeys were planned around need, trade, resources, and connection. Every voyage carried risk, and risk was weighed against necessity. In places like Greenland, that balance was increasingly difficult to maintain. Greenland's settlements survived under constant limitation. The land offered little timber. Soil was thin. Supplies depended on successful travel and exchange. Driftwood washed ashore occasionally, shaped by currents from distant lands, but it was unpredictable and often insufficient. And when stories began to circulate of land farther west, land glimpsed through fog, with forests near the shore, those stories were listened to with care, not as myths, as possibilities. And from this world of restraint, observation, and quiet endurance, the journey toward Vinland would eventually begin. The first sight of land beyond the Western Ocean did not come from ambition or careful planning. It came from uncertainty. Around the year 985, a Norse merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson set sail from Iceland toward Greenland. His goal was simple. He intended to join his father, who had recently settled there. The route was known, but the sea rarely followed expectation. Soon after leaving familiar waters, weather turned against him. Strong winds pushed his ship westward. Fog settled thick across the sea, hiding stars and horizon alike. Days passed without clear direction. The crew adjusted the sail, trusted the feel of the waves beneath the hull, and waited for conditions to change. When the mist finally thinned, unfamiliar land appeared. Bjarni and his crew saw low hills and wooded coastline, a place that did not match Greenland or Iceland. Trees stood close to the shore, dark and dense. The land looked neither icy nor barren. It was different and clearly not known to them. They did not go ashore. The ship was not prepared for exploration. Supplies were limited, and the crew's focus remained on reaching Greenland. After observing the coastline from a distance, Bjarni turned his ship eastward once more. Eventually, he reached Greenland safely. There, his account spread quietly among the settlers. He spoke of land beyond the ocean, seen with his own eyes, not as a tale of wonder, but as a straightforward report. Forested shores, unknown terrain, a place far to the west. Some listened with curiosity, others with caution. Years passed. Among those who remembered Bjarni's words was Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. Leif was already familiar with long voyages and careful preparation. When he chose to act on what he had heard, it was not impulsive. He acquired a ship, gathered a small crew, and stocked provisions with intention. This voyage was not meant to conquer or settle. It was meant to confirm. Leif followed the general direction Bjarni had described. As his ship moved west, the ocean changed subtly. Currents shifted. Birds appeared more frequently. The color of the water lightened in places, hinting at nearby land. Eventually, the coast emerged. Leif and his crew first reached a rocky shoreline, flat, pale stone shaped by cold and wind. The land felt exposed and severe. There was little vegetation and few signs of shelter. They named this place Helluland, the land of flat stones. They did not stay long. Continuing south, the landscape changed. Forests appeared near the shore, tall and dense. Trees stood close together, offering timber in abundance. This place they named Markland, the land of forests. Here, the value was immediately clear. Still, Leif pressed onward. Sailing farther south, the air softened. The sea grew calmer. The land opened into gentler terrain with grass-covered areas and streams that moved quietly toward the shore. In season, wild plants grew freely, and the climate felt more forgiving. This land they called Vinland. Leif and his crew came ashore and built temporary shelters, using timber and turf. They remained long enough to observe the land, gather resources, and allow both people and ship to recover from the journey. They did not build with permanence in mind. When the time came, Leif returned to Greenland, carrying timber, knowledge, and certainty. Vinland was real. It could be reached, and it offered things the North lacked. The story spread without urgency or exaggeration, and among those who listened carefully was a man who believed that Vinland deserved more than a brief visit. When Leif Erikson's account of Vinland reached the Norse settlements, it did not cause immediate excitement. There were no sudden preparations or hurried departures. The information settled slowly into conversation, weighed against the realities of distance, weather, and survival. Among those who considered it seriously was Thorfinn Karlsefni. Karlsefni was known as a trader, a man accustomed to long voyages and practical decisions. He understood that reaching Vinland once was different from attempting to live there. A settlement would require more than a ship and a small crew. It would require planning, cooperation, and patience. When Karlsefni prepared his expedition, its purpose was clear. This was not simply a journey of exploration. It was an attempt to remain. Several ships were outfitted and loaded carefully. Supplies included food for an extended stay, tools for daily work, and materials for building. Livestock were brought aboard: cattle, sheep, and goats, animals that required space, attention, and steady care. Women and children were included, signaling an intention toward continuity rather than return. The voyage west followed a route already known. The ships reached Helluland and Markland in turn, stopping briefly where conditions allowed. Timber was gathered where forests met the shore, and the crews rested before continuing south. These places were not destinations, but markers along a familiar path. When the fleet arrived in Vinland, the land appeared as it had before: open, workable, and calm. The settlement was established near the same location Leif had used, now known as Leifspathir, the site identified today as Landsok Meadows. Shelters were expanded beyond temporary use. Turf walls were raised thicker and higher. Timber frames were set with care. Central hearths were built to provide heat and light through colder months. The work was steady and methodical. Animals were brought ashore and guided to graze where grass allowed. Fishing began immediately in nearby waters. Small groups explored the surrounding area cautiously, learning the land through movement rather than maps. Days passed without event. Food was prepared, shelters maintained, and routines established. Children adapted quickly to the environment, moving freely within the settlement. Adults worked quietly, aware of the distance between Vinland and everything familiar. Over time, signs appeared that others lived in the region. At first, these signs were subtle: distant movement, traces along the shoreline, objects unfamiliar in shape or use. The Norse referred to these people as Skrælings, a term reflecting difference rather than understanding. Early encounters were cautious. Trade may have occurred, guided by gesture rather than language. Goods were exchanged without ceremony. Neither side lingered longer than necessary. Curiosity was present, but so was uncertainty. As seasons changed, tension grew. Misunderstandings accumulated. The Norse were few and far from support. They relied on fragile supply lines and limited resources. Encounters became less predictable. Some ended in brief, confused conflict. These moments were not frequent, but they carried weight. At the same time, practical challenges became harder to ignore. Livestock required grazing areas that could not always be secured. Weather patterns shifted unexpectedly. Repairs grew more difficult without steady resupply. Each small problem demanded attention. Eventually, Karlsefni gathered the group. The decision was not sudden, it was measured. Vinland offered resources and possibility, but the cost of staying was becoming clear. Distance, vulnerability, and uncertainty outweighed the benefits. The choice was made to leave. The settlement was dismantled carefully. Usable materials were packed away. Animals were loaded onto ships. The longhouses were left standing, their walls settling quietly back into the earth. When the fleet turned eastward, there was no celebration and no defeat, only acceptance. Finland had been reached, lived in, and understood. Before that understanding led to departure, however, there was a period when life in Finland followed a steady, ordinary rhythm, shaped not by conflict, but by daily work and the passing of seasons. It is to that time that we now turn. During the early period of the settlement, before tensions grew and before the idea of departure entered discussion, life in Vinland settled into a quiet and workable rhythm. There was no sense of urgency in these days. The land provided enough, and the settlement was small enough to remain manageable. Each morning began with light rather than sound. The sun rose gradually over low ground, and its warmth reached the shelters slowly, filtering through turf walls and narrow openings. Blankets made from wool and hides were folded and set aside. Embers were stirred back into flame, and the day began without ceremony. Food preparation shaped much of the morning. Fishing was reliable, and nets were checked early while waters remained calm. Fish were cleaned near the shore and carried back to the settlement in small groups. Some were eaten fresh, cooked simply over open flames. Others were prepared for drying, laid out carefully where wind and air could reach them. Livestock were tended quietly. Animals were guided rather than driven, moved slowly to avoid stress or injury. Milk was collected when possible and used quickly. Nothing was produced in excess. Storage was limited, and balance mattered more than accumulation. Meals were modest. People gathered near hearths or outside when weather allowed. Food was shared without hierarchy. There were no formal meal times. Eating followed work, not the other way around. Conversation was sparse, not from tension, but from familiarity. Everyone understood what needed to be done. Clothing was adapted to the environment. Wool garments were worn in layers, adjusted as temperature changed throughout the day. Cloaks were fastened against wind and loosened when movement required freedom. Leather boots softened with fat allowed walking across damp ground without injury. Wet clothing was managed carefully, dried slowly to preserve its shape and usefulness. Children moved easily through the settlement. They watched adults work, mimicking tasks in small ways, carrying light items, gathering small pieces of wood, learning where not to step. Their presence added movement and quiet sound to the day, but rarely noise. Exploration was cautious and deliberate. Small groups moved short distances from the settlement, never beyond sight of familiar landmarks. They learned where water pooled after rain, where grass remained longest, where wind cut strongest across open ground. Knowledge grew slowly, shaped by repetition rather than discovery. As evening approached, activity slowed. Animals were brought closer to shelter. Tools were gathered and stored. Fires were built higher as temperatures dropped. Smoke rose steadily and drifted away across open land. Night brought stillness. Inside the longhouses, people lay close together, sharing warmth as they always had. Outside, the land rested unchanged. Wind moved through grass. Water flowed quietly toward the sea. These days were not remembered for what happened. They were remembered for how they felt. Steady, workable, and calm. It was during this period, when Vinland functioned without strain, that the settlement came closest to becoming routine. And beyond the shelters, the land itself remained patient, offering space and silence to those who moved through it carefully. During the time the settlement was active, Vinland was not experienced as a destination or a claim. It was experienced as surroundings. The land revealed itself gradually, not through landmarks or boundaries, but through repeated movement. Paths formed where feet passed often. Grass bent and rose again. Stones shifted slightly under weight and then settled back into place. Morning air was cool and clean. Moisture rested on leaves and low plants, catching light briefly before fading. The ground held the night's chill longer than expected, especially near water, where mist lingered and moved slowly with the breeze. The forest stood close but not enclosing. Trees grew near the settlement's edge, their branches reaching outward rather than upward. Moss-covered, shaded trunks. Fallen limbs lay where they had dropped, untouched unless needed. The forest was entered carefully, never rushed, and never taken for granted. Sounds were subtle. Birds called occasionally, never continuously. Wind moved through leaves in uneven patterns. Insects appeared in warmer light and disappeared again as temperatures shifted. Nothing announced itself loudly or for long. Beyond the forest, open ground stretched toward the water. The shoreline was irregular, shaped by small inlets and low ridges. Waves reached land gently, more often sliding than striking. The sound of water was steady and low, blending easily into the background of the day. From certain points, the sea felt close enough to touch. From others, it felt distant, even though it was never far away. The Norse moved between these spaces without comment, adjusting their pace to the land rather than expecting the land to adjust to them. Weather changed often, but rarely without warning. Clouds gathered slowly. Wind shifted direction before strength. Rain arrived lightly at first, then more steadily, then passed on without urgency. When storms came, they were prepared for, not feared. Shelters held. Fires were managed. People stayed close together. Light played a quiet role in daily life. Sunrise arrived early in warmer months and lingered longer than in Greenland. Shadows moved slowly across open ground, marking time without measurement. As evening approached, light softened rather than faded, allowing work to end naturally rather than abruptly. At night, darkness settled gradually. Stars appeared when skies cleared, scattered and familiar. The sea reflected faint light when the moon rose. Inside the shelters, firelight flickered across walls and faces, creating warmth rather than brightness. These moments were not recorded. They were not spoken of as special. They passed without comment, absorbed into the pattern of days. Vinland did not feel new after the first weeks, and it did not feel permanent. It felt present. This sense of presence, of being somewhere without needing to define it, shaped how people moved, rested, and worked. The land was neither hostile nor welcoming. It simply existed and allowed them to exist within it for a time. Only later would Vinland become a place spoken of in past tense. For now, it was lived in quietly, without expectation of how long that would last. For a time, the routines of the settlement continued without disruption. Days followed one another with steady familiarity, shaped by work, weather, and rest. Yet beneath this surface, calm, small pressures began to appear. They did not arrive suddenly. The first signs were practical rather than dramatic. Supplies that had once seemed sufficient required closer attention. Certain materials were used more carefully than before. Tasks that had been easy early on took slightly longer as conditions changed. Seasonal shifts played their part. As summer moved toward autumn, daylight shortened. The air cooled more quickly in the evenings. Moisture lingered longer on the ground. Paths became softer underfoot, and movement required more care. These changes were expected, but they narrowed the margin for error. Livestock needed more attention. Grazing areas remained adequate, but animals had to be watched closely to prevent loss or injury. Shelter became more important as nights grew colder. The effort required to maintain both people and animals increased, stretching time and energy. If something failed, it had to be managed with what was already present. Every decision carried more weight because there was no nearby support. Encounters with the surrounding land also became more complex. Exploration continued, but with increased caution. The settlement was now familiar enough to establish boundaries, places visited often and places avoided. Awareness of other inhabitants of the region remained constant. Encounters were not frequent, but their possibility influenced movement and planning. When contact occurred, it was brief and uncertain. Neither side fully understood the other's intentions. Gestures replaced language. Exchange happened without trust or hostility, but without clarity. Each meeting added to a growing sense of unpredictability. These moments were discussed quietly afterward, not as alarms, but as considerations. The group remained small. They understood that they were guests in a land already lived in by others. This awareness did not bring fear, but it did bring restraint. Weather reinforced these concerns. Autumn storms arrived unevenly. Winds shifted faster than before. Rain fell heavier at times, soaking ground and clothing alike. Fires took more effort to maintain. Rest became more necessary, yet harder to achieve fully. Even so, there was no immediate thought of departure. The settlement continued to function. Work was done, food was gathered, shelters held. Life remained possible, but it demanded more attention than before. Gradually, conversations changed. Not in tone, but in focus. People spoke less about expansion and more about maintenance. Less about what could be done and more about what should be done carefully. These were not signs of failure. They were signs of awareness. Vinland had offered space, resources, and possibility. Now it was revealing its limits, not harshly, but clearly. And as these limits became harder to ignore, the settlement moved toward a moment of decision. The decision to leave Vinland was not made in haste. It came after observation, discussion, and quiet agreement. No single event forced it. Instead, understanding accumulated slowly, shaped by distance, effort, and uncertainty. The settlement had functioned as long as balance held, but that balance required constant attention. Supplies were finite. Livestock needed care through seasons that were becoming less predictable. Encounters with others in the region remained unresolved. The distance to Greenland meant that any serious loss or failure would carry lasting consequences. These realities were not debated emotionally. They were weighed carefully. Karlsefni and the others considered what Vinland offered and what it demanded. The land provided resources, but it did not offer security. Remaining longer would increase risk rather than reduce it. The choice, once clear, was accepted. Preparation for departure began quietly. There was no sense of urgency, but there was purpose. Tasks were completed methodically, each one bringing the settlement closer to closure. Shelters were taken apart where possible. Timber that could be reused was removed. Items too heavy or unnecessary were left behind. Nothing was destroyed. Livestock were gathered and secured. Animals were loaded carefully, moved with patience to avoid injury. Supplies were reorganized for the return journey, prioritizing weight and stability. The land did not resist their leaving. Paths softened. Fires burned low and were allowed to fade. The longhouses stood empty, their turf walls beginning the slow process of settling back into the ground. When the ships were ready, the settlement gathered one last time. There was no ceremony, no farewells spoken aloud. The work had already been done. The ships pushed off from shore and turned eastward. Finland receded quietly behind them, its shape fading into distance without finality or regret. The journey home followed familiar waters. Helluland and Markland passed again, now known places rather than discoveries. Timber gathered earlier was secured aboard. The sea carried them steadily, without resistance. When Greenland's coast finally appeared, the voyage ended as it had begun, with land, shelter, and return. Vinland was not lost. It was left. What remained was knowledge of a place reached, lived in briefly, and understood clearly enough to be released. From that point on, Vinland would exist differently, not as a settlement, but as a memory. After the Norse ships returned eastward and Vinland was left behind, the land did not disappear from conversation at once. For a time, it remained part of shared knowledge. People spoke of it when ships were repaired or when timber was divided. It was mentioned during long winter evenings, not as a destination to be reached again, but as a place that had been known. These recollections were practical. They described forests near the shore, workable land, and a climate that had felt more forgiving than Greenland's. They also carried awareness of distance and uncertainty. Vinland was not spoken of as unfinished business, but as a measured experience. As years passed, fewer people had seen the land themselves. Those who had traveled there aged. Their accounts were repeated by others who had only heard them. Details shifted slightly with each retelling, but the core remained: names, directions, and the sense of having reached something real. Eventually, these accounts entered the written record. In Iceland, generations later, the stories of westward voyages were set down in what we now call the sagas. The saga of the Greenlanders and Eric the Red's saga preserved the memory of Helgeland, Markland, and Vinland, along with the names of those who had traveled there. These texts were not written as precise histories. They were narrative records shaped by memory and meaning. They blended fact with interpretation, but they did not invent geography. Beneath their storytelling structure lay real coastlines, real journeys, and real decisions. Beyond the Norse world, these stories were unknown. Elsewhere in Europe, there was no awareness of lands across the Western Ocean. Trade, politics, and learning moved along established routes, and the Atlantic remained a boundary rather than a bridge. Even within the North, attention shifted. Greenland's settlements faced increasing challenges. Climate grew colder. Trade connections weakened. Isolation deepened. By the 15th century, Norse life in Greenland had faded entirely, leaving behind empty structures and unanswered questions. With this, direct memory of Vinland grew faint. The land across the ocean continued unchanged. Forests grew and fell. Weather shaped coastlines. The remains of Norse buildings in Vinland slowly merged with the soil, becoming part of the landscape itself. For centuries, Vinland existed only in words, and words, without reinforcement, grow quiet over time. For a long time, the stories of Vinland rested without confirmation. They were read, discussed, and debated, but they stood apart from physical proof. Many believed them to be symbolic or exaggerated, shaped by imagination rather than travel. Others felt that something real lay beneath the words, waiting quietly. The land itself kept its silence. In the far north of Newfoundland, winds moved across low ground near the sea. Grass bent and returned upright. Snow settled and melted with the seasons. No markers identified what had once stood there. Then, in the 20th century, attention returned to the sagas, not as legends, but as directions. Researchers began to look for landscapes that matched the descriptions: northern coasts, open shorelines, nearby forests, access to fresh water. Slowly, focus narrowed. At a place now called Lalse Ox Meadows, subtle shapes emerged beneath the ground. They were not obvious at first. Slight rises in the earth suggested walls long since collapsed. Patterns appeared that did not match natural formations. Careful excavation followed, layer by layer, without urgency. What emerged was unmistakable. The outlines of turf-walled buildings formed clear shapes. Their proportions matched Norse longhouses known from Iceland and Greenland. A smithy was identified nearby, along with evidence of ironworking, slag, tools, and the remains of a forge. Iron had been worked there. This detail mattered deeply. Indigenous peoples of the region did not produce iron in this way. The presence of ironworking confirmed that these structures were not local in origin. Additional objects were found. A bronze pin, shaped in a style known from Norse clothing, lay among the remains. Fragments of wood showed marks made by metal tools. Everything pointed to a short-term Norse presence, functional, purposeful, and limited in duration. The site revealed no signs of permanent expansion. There were no cemeteries, no deep layers of rebuilding, no indication of long-term settlement. Instead, it showed what the sagas had suggested all along, a base, used briefly, then left. The land had preserved the truth quietly. Wind and weather had softened the structures but not erased them. Turf walls had collapsed inward, protecting what lay beneath. Over time, nature had sealed the site rather than destroying it. With these discoveries, Vinland moved from story to confirmation. The sagas were no longer only memory. They were supported by earth and evidence, resting together. Vinland was real, and it had been reached centuries before anyone else in Europe would cross the Atlantic again. With the discovery at Land's Oaks Meadows, the question of Vinland's reality was settled. The Norse had crossed the Atlantic. They had reached North America. They had lived there briefly, then departed. Yet what Vinland represented required careful understanding. It was not a colony in the modern sense. There was no attempt at long-term expansion, no sustained migration, no network of settlements. The Norse presence was limited by design and circumstance. Vinland functioned as an extension of exploration. It was a place reached by small groups, not by a population moving outward. Its purpose was practical: access to resources, knowledge of land, and testing the limits of travel. The Norse world at the time was already stretched. Greenland itself depended on fragile trade connections. Ships were few. Routes were dangerous. Maintaining even a single settlement across such distances demanded constant effort. Vinland added one more link to that chain. It was not failure that ended the settlement. It was proportion. The cost of staying outweighed the benefit of remaining. In this way, Vinland stands apart from later narratives of conquest. There was no attempt to impose control, no effort to claim land permanently, no sustained conflict that reshaped the region. The Norse came, lived briefly, and left. Their impact on the land was minimal. The longhouses did not scar the landscape. The forest reclaimed the cleared ground. Over time, even the memory of the settlement faded from local awareness. What endured was knowledge. The Norse proved that the Atlantic could be crossed using their ships, their navigation, and their understanding of sea and sky. They demonstrated that land lay beyond the western horizon. But this knowledge remained contained. It did not spread beyond the north. It did not alter European maps or spark further voyages. It remained part of a regional tradition rather than a global turning point. Vinland's legacy is quiet. It does not announce itself through monuments or conquest. It exists in layers, in sagas, in soil, and in the space between discovery and consequence. It reminds us that history is not always shaped by what lasts longest, but by what happens briefly and leaves without noise. After the Norse ships departed, the land returned to its own rhythms. There was no marker to indicate that people had once lived there. No sound remained. No movement lingered. The shoreline lay quiet beneath changing skies, shaped only by wind, water, and time. Spring arrived first. Snow withdrew slowly from low ground, seeping into soil and stone. Streams widened with meltwater, then narrowed again. Grass pushed through softened earth, bending easily in the breeze. Birds returned, moving along paths older than memory. The outlines of turf walls settled further into the ground. What had once stood above the surface now blended into gentle rises. Moss took hold where warmth and moisture met. Roots pressed into spaces left behind, patient and precise. Summer followed without announcement. Light stretched across long days. The sea reflected the sky in muted tones. Fish moved close to shore again, as they always had. Forests thickened, leaves filtering sunlight into quiet patterns on the ground. Nothing marked the place's former shelter. Autumn came in measured steps. Leaves turned and fell. Wind gathered strength, then released it. Rain softened edges and filled shallow depressions. Paths made by feet disappeared beneath growth and moisture. Winter arrived last. Snow covered everything evenly, smoothing the land into a single surface. Ice formed along water's edge. Silence deepened, broken only by wind or distant movement. The longhouses rested beneath it all. They did not resist the weight. They accepted it, allowing the land to carry them downward until they became part of it. Year after year, this continued. No one spoke the names Helluland, Markland, or Vinland here. No one recalled ships or journeys. Time moved forward without reference to what had passed. And yet, nothing was truly lost. The land remembered in its own way, through layers, patterns, and quiet preservation. What had been placed gently upon it was held, not erased. Centuries later, when people returned with questions rather than need, the land answered. Not with words, but with shapes beneath the grass, with traces of iron, with outlines that matched memory. Vinland had waited, and when it was found again, it revealed itself without urgency, just as it had once been lived in. After the ships had gone and the water closed again behind them, the land did not change its rhythm. Wind continued to move across open ground, bending grass where it still stood. Low clouds passed overhead without pause. The sea reached the shore and withdrew again, as it always had, leaving darkened stone and damp sand behind. What remained of the settlement stood quietly. The longhouses no longer held warmth, but their shapes were still present. Turf walls rose gently from the ground, their surfaces already softening at the edges. Openings faced the shore, dark and unoccupied. Inside, the air was still. Nothing disturbed these spaces. There were no footsteps, no voices, no fires. The ground bore faint impressions where people had once moved, but rain and wind began to blur them almost immediately. Winter arrived without announcement. Cold settled first into the soil, then into the structures themselves. The turf walls held moisture that froze and thawed in slow cycles. Wood tightened, then loosened again as temperature shifted. Nothing broke suddenly. Everything adjusted. Snow came lightly at first. It settled on rooftops and along walls, outlining their forms before softening them. Edges disappeared beneath a thin white layer. What had been clearly shaped by hands now blended more closely with the land around it. Inside the shelters, snow did not reach, but cold did. Air moved through open spaces where doors had once been. The ground hardened. Any remaining traces of use, flattened grass, disturbed earth, became fixed beneath frost. The shoreline changed with the season. Ice formed along the water's edge in uneven lines. Waves moved more slowly where cold held them back. Stones darkened and lightened as moisture froze and released its grip. Further inland, the forest responded. Branches bowed under the weight of snow, then lifted again when it fell away. Needles held frost longer than leaves had. The ground beneath trees remained darker, less exposed to wind. Animals moved through the area without awareness of what had been. Tracks appeared near the structures, then crossed them, then vanished beneath fresh snow. Birds landed briefly on the turf walls, then moved on. Nothing lingered. The remains of the settlement did not stand apart. They were not obstacles. They did not interrupt movement. Snow treated them no differently than stone or earth. Wind passed over them without resistance. Time continued. Storms came and went. Some brought heavy snowfall, others only cold rain that froze as it touched the ground. Between storms, the land rested under clear skies, light reflecting off snow in muted brightness. No one marked the passing days. There were no fires to tend, no shelters to maintain, no animals to gather. The land existed without need or expectation. As winter deepened, the structures settled further. Snow accumulated along their sides, pressing gently. Turf absorbed moisture, then released it. Over time, what had once been vertical softened into curves. Nothing collapsed. Nothing resisted. When thaw began, it came slowly. Ice loosened its hold. Snow thinned and retreated into the ground. Water moved again along shallow paths, carrying small particles with it. The land reshaped itself quietly. The remains of the settlement endured through it all. They were not preserved deliberately. They were simply left undisturbed. What humans had placed there was returned to the care of the land, not erased, not celebrated, only held. And in that holding, time continued its work, layer by layer, season by season. After the first winter passed, the land did not pause to mark it. Cold withdrew slowly, leaving behind softened ground and shallow water where snow had rested. Ice broke apart along the shoreline in uneven fragments, drifting briefly before dissolving back into the sea. The ground absorbed moisture and released it again, settling into familiar patterns. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in stages, white lasting longer, wind warming slightly, movement returning in small, scattered ways. The remains of the settlement emerged gradually from beneath retreating snow, their shapes less defined than before. Turf walls appeared lower. Edges that had once been distinct now blended into surrounding earth. The difference between constructed ground and natural rise became subtle, noticeable only in the way water moved around it. Plants returned where space allowed. Grass grew first, thin and uneven. Moss spread across shaded surfaces, settling into the dampness held within turf. Small flowering plants appeared briefly, then faded again as conditions changed. The longhouses stood quietly through it all. They did not resume their former purpose. They did not wait. They simply remained, responding to weather rather than resisting it. Summer followed. Warmth reached deeper into the ground. Insects moved through open air, then disappeared again. The forest thickened, leaves closing overhead and dimming the light beneath. Wind carried familiar sounds, water moving, branches shifting, distant waves reaching shore. Nothing introduced itself sharply. Everything blended. Animals continued to pass through. Some paused briefly near the structures, drawn by shelter from wind or rain. Others crossed without hesitation. No paths formed. No territory was claimed. The settlement left no boundary. Autumn returned without ceremony. Leaves fell and gathered in shallow depressions. Rain softened soil further, drawing material downslope and into low places. Wood darkened, then lightened again as it dried. Each year repeated this pattern with slight variation. Storms reshaped small details. One winter brought heavier snow than the last. One summer lingered longer before cooling. None of these changes altered the land's overall direction. Time did not hurry. The remains of the settlement continued to settle. Wood decayed gradually, not collapsing but thinning. Turf walls compressed under their own weight. Openings narrowed as earth shifted inward. What had once been inside and outside grew harder to distinguish. The land absorbed everything evenly. Iron left behind did not vanish. It changed slowly, reacting with air and moisture, darkening, then resting again. It did not announce itself. It remained where it had been placed. No one noticed. Years passed without names. There were no stories attached to these seasons now. No memory refreshed them. The land moved forward without reference to what had occurred upon it. Grass grew and died. Snow fell and melted. Water followed the same paths it always had, shaping them incrementally, patiently. The sea remained constant. Waves reached shore, withdrew, and returned again. Tides rose and fell without interruption. The horizon remained unchanged. What had been human presence became quiet matter. Not gone, only incorporated. And so, the long quiet continued, unbroken by observation, uninterrupted by return. Years passed without distinction. They did not gather meaning as they moved forward. They did not separate themselves from one another. One season followed the next, not as chapters, but as variations of the same quiet process. Spring returned again and again. Each time, meltwater traced familiar paths across the ground. Some channels deepened slightly, others filled and disappeared. Grass followed light and moisture, growing where conditions allowed, thinning where they did not. The remains of the settlement changed slowly. What had once stood apart from the land now followed its contours. Turf walls pressed lower, their edges softened by rain and frost. The ground no longer resisted their presence. It held them without distinction. Summer brought warmth that reached deeper into the soil. The surface dried, then cracked in places, then softened again after rain. Insects moved through the air in brief cycles, appearing with heat and fading when it passed. The forest grew denser at its edges, leaves overlapping, branches shading the ground beneath. Light lingered longer during these months. It moved across the landscape without interruption, tracing the slow arc of the sun. Shadows lengthened and shortened without marking time. No one counted the days. Autumn followed, as it always did. Leaves fell steadily, covering low ground and shallow depressions. Wind shifted more frequently. Rain arrived heavier at times, then receded. The remains of the settlement gathered debris, leaves, soil, moisture, becoming less visible with each passing year. Winter returned without ceremony. Snow covered everything evenly, erasing surface differences. The land became quieter, sound dampened beneath cold and accumulation. The sea continued its motion, slower at times, never stopping. Ice formed, broke, and formed again. Nothing required protection. Nothing waited for warmth. The land held what it held. These cycles repeated. No single year stood apart. No change occurred suddenly enough to demand attention. Everything adjusted gradually, responding to pressure, temperature, and movement. Wood continued to break down. Exposed beams softened, darkened, and thinned. Buried pieces remained longer, protected by soil and moisture. Turf walls compressed further, their internal structure settling into the earth. Iron remained present, though altered. It darkened, then rested. It responded to air and water without urgency. It did not disappear, but it no longer served purpose. The distinction between what had been placed and what had always been there faded. Ground leveled itself, edges rounded, shapes smoothed. From a distance the land appeared unchanged. Only when light fell a certain way or water pooled unevenly did subtle differences appear. Slight rises, shallow hollows, traces of earlier arrangement. But no one observed these details. The land did not require recognition. Time continued without reference. Years passed like weather, arriving, lingering, and moving on, leaving behind only gradual transformation. Nothing ended. Nothing began. Everything continued. Beyond the quiet land, the ocean continued its work. The Atlantic did not change course or character after the Norse ships departed. It remained wide, patient, and indifferent to passage. Waves moved across its surface in long patterns shaped by wind and current, rising and falling without pause. Storms crossed its expanse as they always had. Some formed far to the south, gathering strength before turning north. Others developed quickly, driven by sudden shifts in air and temperature. They passed over the water, leaving no trace once they moved on. Between storms, the sea lay open and calm. Light reflected unevenly across its surface. Swells moved slowly beneath, barely visible until they reached shallower ground. The water carried sound differently here, distant, muted, absorbed. The distance between continents remained unchanged. The eastern shores lay far beyond the horizon, separated by days and weeks of travel. The western lands rested where they always had, shaped by the same tides and winds. No paths crossed the ocean now. No wakes disturbed its surface. No sails broke the line of sky and water. The sea moved without interruption, carrying only what belonged to it. Currents continued to flow. They carried cold water southward, warmer water northward, mixing slowly, endlessly. Debris moved with them. Wood, seaweed, fragments shaped by water rather than intention. The ocean remembered nothing. It did not hold stories of crossings or return. It did not preserve routes or mark distances. It existed as it always had, connecting and separating at the same time. Along the coast, tides rose and fell. They reached the land, then withdrew again, drawing lines that shifted slightly with each cycle. Shorelines adjusted incrementally. Stones rolled. Sand redistributed itself. What had once been landing places became ordinary ground again. No sign distinguished them from any other stretch of coast. The sea treated them all equally. Weather moved freely across water and land alike. Wind gathered strength, then released it. Fog formed where air and water met, drifting without direction until it thinned and disappeared. Rain fell into the sea without sound. Night crossed the ocean in the same way it crossed land. Stars reflected faintly on the water when skies were clear. When clouds gathered, darkness settled evenly. Nothing marked the hours. The Atlantic remained a space of distance, not hostile, not welcoming, simply wide enough to separate memory from place. And so the ocean continued to hold that distance, allowing time to deepen the quiet that had already settled over the land. Long after the land and sea settled into their quiet rhythms, Vinland continued to exist in words. At first, those words were clear. They described coastlines, forests near the shore, and land that could support brief settlement. They named places reached by sail and marked distances measured in days. These accounts remained close to experience, shaped by those who had seen the land themselves. But memory depends on renewal. As years passed, fewer people carried direct knowledge of Vinland. Those who had traveled there aged, and their stories were repeated by others who had only heard them spoken. With each telling, emphasis shifted. Details that once mattered practically became less important. Direction softened. Measurements lost precision. What remained was the idea of a land beyond the Western Sea. Real, but distant. Vinland became a reference rather than a destination. It was mentioned alongside other far places, not as a goal to be reached again, but as something that had once been known. The knowledge remained intact, but it no longer directed action. In Greenland, attention turned inward. Life there demanded constant effort. Climate grew colder. Trade routes weakened. Survival required focus on immediate concerns. Distant lands offered little advantage when resources at home were uncertain. As generations passed, Vinland receded further. The names Helgeland and Markland remained familiar longer, tied as they were to practical resources like stone and timber. Vinland, farther still, slipped more easily into abstraction. Stories changed shape. They were fitted into larger narratives of exploration and lineage. They were remembered not for their details, but for what they represented: the reach of ships, the breadth of the sea, the skill of navigation. Eventually, even these stories grew quieter. They were told less often. Written down later, they preserved memory in fixed form, but removed it from daily use. Without repetition, knowledge became static. The land itself did not change in response. Forests continued to grow and fall. Weather shaped coastlines. Seasons passed without regard for whether they were remembered. Vinland existed as it always had, not dependent on human awareness. And so memory faded, not through loss but through distance. What was not revisited did not vanish. It simply moved out of reach. Centuries passed without renewal of contact. The land that had once held the settlement continued to change, but only in the ways land always does. Forests expanded and thinned. Shorelines shifted slightly with each season. The remains of human presence lay beneath layers of growth and soil, unmarked and unobserved. Generations lived and died elsewhere. Across the ocean, societies changed direction, formed alliances, and faced challenges unrelated to distant western lands. Knowledge traveled along familiar routes, bound to trade and communication. Vinland lay outside those paths. Written accounts remained. They were copied and preserved, but not acted upon. They existed as part of a broader record, neither emphasized nor forgotten entirely. Their words remained stable even as their relevance diminished. Language itself shifted over time. Names were read differently. Pronunciations changed. The context that once made these places immediate grew faint. Without experience to anchor them, the names became abstract. Meanwhile, the Atlantic continued its steady motion. No regular crossings bridged the distance. The ocean maintained separation, not through force, but through scale. The effort required to cross it remained greater than the incentive. The land waited without intention. It did not preserve itself deliberately. It simply remained undisturbed. Organic materials broke down gradually. Inorganic traces endured longer, quiet and unremarkable. Season followed season. Cold years and mild years passed in sequence. Storms reshaped small features. Growth and decay balanced one another. The longhouses became indistinct. What had once been walls and openings became shallow rises. Soil settled. Grass and moss claimed surfaces evenly. From above, nothing suggested design. The place no longer announced itself. If someone had stood there centuries later, they would have seen only land shaped by natural forces. The past would not have revealed itself easily. And yet, it remained present. Time does not erase. It layers. What lay beneath the surface continued to exist, waiting without awareness. Centuries accumulated not as events, but as quiet continuity. And through that continuity, the space between memory and place grew wide. For a long time, nothing disturbed the quiet that had settled over the land. Then, gradually, attention began to return. Not to the place itself, but to the idea of it. This attention did not arrive as urgency or ambition. It came as curiosity, shaped by reading rather than movement. The old accounts were still there. They existed in written form, preserved and copied through generations. They were read alongside other texts, sometimes carefully, sometimes in passing. For most readers, they remained distant, their descriptions too vague to inspire action. Yet curiosity does not require certainty. It builds slowly, returning to the same words, noticing patterns that had once been overlooked. Names were compared, distances reconsidered. Descriptions of coastlines and resources were read with renewed interest. This attention remained quiet. It did not seek proof immediately. It did not announce conclusions. It simply asked whether the land described might still exist in some identifiable form. The land itself did not respond. It remained unchanged by thought or inquiry. Forests continued their cycles. Weather moved freely across open ground. What lay beneath the surface remained undisturbed. Curiosity grew elsewhere. Scholars discussed the text among themselves. Some doubted their accuracy. Others believed they described real journeys, shaped by memory but grounded in experience. These discussions did not lead to immediate action. Distance still mattered. Travel required resources. The western lands remained far, and attention was often drawn elsewhere. Time continued to pass. Interest rose and fell. The text remained, patient and unchanged. The land waited without awareness. When attention returned again, it did so more deliberately. Descriptions were read with geography in mind. Coasts, currents, and climate were considered together. The idea that the accounts might correspond to a real place became more plausible. Still, nothing moved quickly. Curiosity remained measured. It respected uncertainty. It accepted that proof, if it existed, would not announce itself easily. The land continued to hold what it held. What had been placed there centuries earlier remained beneath layers of soil and growth, unchanged by human thought. And so attention returned, not as discovery, but as readiness. A readiness to listen. The land did not preserve the past deliberately. It did not choose what to keep or what to release. It responded only to pressure, moisture, temperature, and time. And yet, through these simple processes, it held memory in quiet layers. Soil accumulated slowly. Each year added a thin trace. Fallen leaves breaking down, grasses returning to earth. Wind carried particles settling where movement slowed. These layers did not bury what lay beneath all at once. They settled gently, conforming to shapes already there. The remains of the settlement rested within this gradual covering. Turf walls, once lifted and shaped by hands, became part of the ground again. Their structure compressed, but did not vanish. Beneath the surface, outlines remained intact, protected from erosion by the very soil that concealed them. Wood endured differently. Exposed pieces softened and broke down over time, returning to the land through slow decay. Buried fragments lasted longer, shielded from air and light. They darkened, thinned, and rested in place, no longer functional, but not erased. Iron changed at its own pace. It reacted with moisture, forming layers that slowed further transformation. It did not dissolve quickly. It remained present, altered but recognizable in form, waiting without awareness. Stone stayed constant. It shifted only when water moved it, when frost expanded and released its grip. Where stone had been placed intentionally, it remained close to that position, settling rather than traveling. The land arranged everything evenly. There was no distinction between what had been natural and what had been introduced. All materials responded to the same forces. All were held by the same ground. From above, the surface appeared ordinary. Grass covered low rises. Moss filled shallow depressions. Water pooled where it always had. Nothing on the surface announced what lay beneath. And yet, Below, order remained. The arrangement of space, walls, rooms, openings, endured in compressed form. Not visible, not remembered, but present. This is how ground holds memory, not as narrative or meaning, but as structure, not as story, but as pattern. Time did not disturb this memory, it protected it. Layer by layer, season by season, the land carried forward what had once been placed upon it, without judgment or urgency. And so the ground remained ready, not waiting, simply holding. When people eventually returned to the place with questions, they did not arrive with certainty. They came slowly, guided by texts, maps, and comparison rather than conviction. The land they reached did not resemble the descriptions exactly, nor did it contradict them. It offered no immediate confirmation. At first, there was only ground. Low rises in the earth suggested nothing unusual. Grass moved with the wind. Stones lay scattered without pattern. The shoreline appeared like many others along the coast. Attention focused on small details. Subtle changes in elevation. Soil that behaved differently when pressed. Shapes that repeated themselves in ways nature rarely produces alone. These observations did not announce conclusions. They invited patience. Work began gently. Soil was removed in thin layers, carefully set aside. Each change was recorded. Nothing was rushed. The goal was not discovery, but understanding. As layers were lifted, patterns emerged. Lines formed beneath the surface, curving and meeting at angles too deliberate to ignore. The outlines of walls appeared, not standing, but remembered in compressed earth. The shapes were familiar. They matched structures known from elsewhere, not identical, but consistent in proportion and form. These were not fortifications. They were dwellings arranged with purpose and restraint. Nearby, other traces appeared. A small area showed signs of intense heat. Darkened soil held fragments altered by fire. Material gathered there spoke quietly of transformation, not destruction, but making. Iron had been worked. This detail mattered, but it was not celebrated. It was noted. It was placed within context. It joined other observations rather than standing alone. Objects emerged gradually. A fragment here. A shaped piece there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing whole. Each item carried weight only because it fit with others. Clothing fasteners, shaped in a style known from the north. Tool marks left by metal edges. Wood worked with intention. Together, they formed a picture. Not of conquest or permanence, but of presence. The site revealed no signs of long occupation. There were no layers of rebuilding, no deep accumulation of waste, no graves marking generations. Everything suggested a place used briefly, then left. This matched what had been written. The land and the text spoke quietly to one another, not arguing, not exaggerating. They aligned without effort. The work continued with care. Nothing was removed unnecessarily. The site was treated as something shared, between past and present, between land and memory. What had been held by the ground for centuries was allowed to remain largely in place. Understanding did not require exposure. It required listening. And in that listening, the story of Vinland became clear again. Not as legend, not as triumph, but as a brief and measured crossing that left only light traces behind. With the land and the texts aligned, understanding did not arrive all at once. It formed gradually, shaped by restraint rather than certainty. The evidence did not demand reinterpretation of history. It asked only for adjustment, a quiet widening of perspective. The Norse had reached North America. This fact stood plainly, without need for emphasis. It did not overturn what was already known. It did not diminish later voyages or alter the course of centuries that followed. It simply added depth to what had already been understood about human movement and curiosity. Vinland was not a beginning, nor was it an ending. It was a moment, brief, deliberate, and limited by circumstance. It showed what was possible with the tools, knowledge, and intentions of the time. It also showed what was not sustainable. The Norse did not fail in Vinland. They assessed, adapted, and withdrew. They recognized limits and respected them. This choice reflected experience rather than weakness. Understanding this changes the tone of the story. Vinland is not a forgotten triumph. It is not a missed opportunity. It is an example of measured exploration, one that did not seek permanence at all costs. The land itself confirms this. There is no evidence of expansion, no attempt to reshape the region extensively. The Norse presence left only light marks, consistent with a temporary base rather than a colony. This aligns with how the Norse world functioned elsewhere. Settlements succeeded where networks could support them. Where distance stretched too far, restraint prevailed. Vinland lay beyond the reach of sustained connection. Understanding also brings clarity to the sagas. They are neither myths nor precise records. They are memory shaped by meaning. Their accuracy lies not in exact detail, but in proportion. They describe a land reached, lived in briefly, and left. Nothing more, nothing less. This understanding does not elevate Vinland above other histories. Indigenous peoples lived in these regions long before Norse arrival and continued long after their departure. The Norse presence did not define the land, it passed through it. Recognizing this keeps the story grounded. Vinland matters not because it was first, but because it was real, and because it was handled with restraint. What remains, after understanding settles, is quiet respect. For the people who crossed the sea, for the land that held their traces, for time which preserved them without announcement. Vinland does not ask to be celebrated. It asks only to be understood as it was. At the edge of land and water, nothing asks to be remembered. The sea continues its motion, shaped by wind and current, rising and falling without regard for who has crossed it before. Waves reach the shore, pause briefly, and return again. This rhythm has no beginning and no end. The land remains. Grass bends and lifts. Trees grow, shed leaves, and grow again. Stone shifts only when pressed by water or frost. Soil gathers what falls upon it and releases it slowly. What once passed through this place has settled into the same pattern. The Norse ships are gone. Their journeys belong to another time. The paths they followed across the ocean exist now only as potential, routes that could be taken, not marks that remain. The longhouses rest beneath the ground. They are no longer structures. They are shapes within earth held quietly among roots and stone. They do not demand attention. They do not tell their story aloud. They simply remain. The land does not distinguish between past and present. It carries everything evenly. The weight of seasons, the traces of weather, the faint impressions of brief presence. Nothing is singled out. Nothing is erased. Understanding, once reached, does not disturb this balance. Knowledge settles as gently as snow, resting without pressure. It does not require repetition. It does not need to be carried forward urgently. The story of Vinland now exists where it belongs. In written words, read quietly. In ground, holding shape without display. In sea, maintaining distance without barrier. And in time, moving forward without reference. There is no final moment, no closing gesture, only continuation. The wind moves across open ground, the ocean breathes against the shore, and the land holds what it has always held, calmly, patiently, without asking to be noticed. Here, the story rests.